The desert sun beats down mercilessly on July 4th, 1187, as 20,000 Crusader knights and foot soldiers march toward their doom. They don't know it yet, but in less than 24 hours, the most powerful Christian army ever assembled in the Holy Land will be utterly destroyed. The Muslim commander orchestrating their annihilation, Saladin, is about to fight the battle that will change the course of history and reclaim Jerusalem. This is the story of Hattin, the battle that broke the back of the Crusader kingdoms and announced to the world that a new power had risen in the east. The year is 1187, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem stands at the height of its territorial expansion, yet teeters on the edge of catastrophe. For 88 years, Christian knights from Europe have ruled over the Holy Land, carving out 4 Crusader states from territory seized during the First Crusade. These warriors, clad in mail and surcoat bearing the cross, have built massive stone fortresses across the Levant, from Antioch in the north to the scorching deserts of Outremer in the south. But now, a unified Muslim force under one brilliant leader threatens to sweep them all away. To understand the magnitude of what happens at Hattin, we must first understand the man who engineered this victory. Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, was born in 1137 in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq. He was not born to rule. His family were Kurdish military officers serving various Muslim rulers, and young Saladin seemed destined for a career as a competent but unremarkable soldier. One of his contemporaries wrote that in his youth, Saladin preferred religious study to military training, and his uncle had to practically drag him to war. Yet this reluctant warrior would become the most formidable Muslim commander since the early days of Islam. Saladin's rise to power was neither quick nor easy. He served under the Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din, fighting in Egypt where he eventually became vizier, and then sultan after a complex series of political maneuvers and battles. By 1174, when Nur ad-Din died, Saladin controlled Egypt, but controlling Egypt was not enough. The Muslim world was fractured, divided between rival dynasties, competing sultanates, and petty kingdoms that spent as much time fighting each other as they did the Crusaders. A soldier who served under Saladin later recalled the mood of those years, saying, "We feared the Franks less than we feared our own brothers, for a Muslim blade was as likely to find a Muslim target as a Christian one." Saladin understood that to defeat the Crusaders, he first had to unite the Muslim world. From 1174 to 1186, he waged a careful campaign of diplomacy and warfare, bringing Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul under his control. He married strategically, forged alliances, bought loyalty, and when necessary, crushed opposition with overwhelming force. The great medieval historian Ibn al-Athir wrote that Saladin could be as gentle as a shepherd with those who submitted, but as fierce as a lion with those who resisted. By 1186, Saladin controlled a unified territory stretching from Egypt through Syria to northern Mesopotamia. He commanded the resources of multiple kingdoms, could field armies numbering in the tens of thousands, and most importantly, he had unified the fractious Muslim emirs under the banner of jihad, holy war to reclaim Jerusalem. Facing this rising power were the Crusader states, and they were far from united. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was ruled by Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman who had married into the royal family, but whose claim to the throne was disputed. Guy was not a skilled military commander. Contemporary chronicles describe him as indecisive, easily influenced, and lacking the respect of his nobles. One of his own knights, Raymond III of Tripoli, openly despised him and had even formed a separate truce with Saladin. The Crusader military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, pursued their own agendas and often acted independently of royal authority. The kingdom was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of Reynald of Chatillon, perhaps the most reckless and provocative of all the Crusader lords. Reynald controlled the fortress of Kerak, strategically positioned to threaten Muslim caravans traveling between Egypt and Syria. Despite repeated truces and Saladin's warnings, Reynald repeatedly attacked these caravans, seizing goods, taking prisoners, and even threatening to march on Mecca and Medina themselves. In late 1186, Reynald ambushed a particularly important caravan that included Saladin's own sister. The sources disagree on whether she was actually captured, but the insult was unbearable. Saladin sent a message to Reynald, demanding the release of the prisoners and compensation for the seized goods. Reynald's response was defiant. He declared that no truce bound him, and that he would do as he pleased in his own territory. A Muslim chronicler recorded Saladin's reaction to this news. He vowed before his emirs that he would kill Reynald with his own hands. This was not just about a broken truce or stolen goods. This was personal, and Saladin began to plan his campaign. In the spring of 1187, Saladin called for a full mobilization. His message went out to every corner of his realm. From Egypt came Mamluk cavalry, elite slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of war, mounted on Arabian horses and armed with composite bows and curved swords. From Syria came the Askar, professional cavalry from the great cities of Damascus and Aleppo, men who had fought the Crusaders for generations. From the eastern provinces came Turkoman horse archers, light cavalry who could fire arrows at full gallop and wheel away before the enemy could respond. From the mountain regions came Kurdish warriors, tough and disciplined infantry, religious volunteers, men who came for the cause of jihad rather than pay, swelled the ranks further. By late June 1187, Saladin had assembled the largest Muslim army seen in the region in decades. Modern historians estimate his total force at between 20 and 30,000 men, though some contemporary Muslim sources claim numbers as high as 40,000 or more. These figures are likely exaggerated, but what matters is that Saladin commanded a massive, well-supplied, and unified host. His army was diverse in composition, but unified in purpose. On June 26th, Saladin crossed the Jordan River and entered Crusader territory. His target was not Jerusalem, not yet. First, he needed to destroy the Crusader army, and he knew exactly how to make them come to him. Saladin's army swept through the Galilee region, the fertile heartland of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His forces besieged the city of Tiberias, a relatively minor but symbolically important target because it was the capital of Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most powerful Crusader lords. More importantly, Raymond's wife, Eshkiva of Bures, was trapped inside the city with only a small garrison. The outer city fell quickly, and Eshkiva retreated to the citadel. She sent urgent messages to King Guy, begging for relief. The trap was set. Saladin knew the Crusaders would feel compelled to respond. Their entire military culture, their code of chivalry, their religious duty, all demanded that they march to rescue a noblewoman under siege. King Guy assembled the Crusader army at Sephoria, a well-watered camp about 25 kilometers from Tiberias. The muster was impressive. From every castle, town, and fortification in the kingdom, knights and soldiers had gathered. The core of the army consisted of roughly 1,200 heavily armored knights. These were not the romantic figures of legend, but professional warriors whose lives revolved around mounted combat. A Crusader knight wore a full hauberk, a long coat of mail made from thousands of interlocking iron rings that covered him from neck to knee. Over this, he wore a surcoat, often white with a red cross, that helped deflect the sun's heat. On his head sat a cylindrical great helm, a bucket of steel that offered excellent protection, but severely limited vision and hearing. He carried a kite-shaped shield, usually made of wood covered in leather and reinforced with metal. His primary weapon was the lance, a 3-meter shaft of ash wood, tipped with a steel point, designed for the devastating cavalry charge that was the centerpiece of Crusader tactics. At his side hung a long, straight, double-edged sword, typically weighing around 1 to 1.5 kilograms, balanced for powerful cutting strokes. Some knights also carried maces or warhammers, particularly effective against armored opponents. The knight's warhorse, or destrier, was a massive animal bred specifically for combat, trained to charge into enemy formations and bite and kick in the melee. Supporting these knights were the Turcopoles, light cavalry of mixed Christian and local origin who served as scouts and skirmishers. They were less heavily armored than the knights, but more mobile, often armed with bows, spears, and light swords. The infantry numbered perhaps 15 to 18,000 men, though this figure is debated. These foot soldiers varied widely in quality. The military orders contributed disciplined sergeants, professional soldiers who fought as heavy infantry with spear, sword, and shield. The kingdom's urban militias provided crossbowmen, men who wielded one of the most effective anti-cavalry weapons of the medieval period. The crossbow was a mechanical marvel that could be learned relatively quickly, unlike the longbow, and it could punch through mail at close range. However, it was slow to reload, requiring the user to place his foot in a stirrup at the front of the weapon and use both arms, or a mechanical device called a cranaquin, to pull back the bowstring. The bulk of the infantry consisted of common soldiers, less well-trained and equipped, carrying spears, axes, and whatever armor they could afford. The Crusader army also brought the True Cross, the single most sacred relic in Christendom, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross upon which Christ was crucified. This relic was normally kept in Jerusalem, but in times of great need, it accompanied the army into battle. Its presence was meant to inspire the soldiers and guarantee divine favor. The Bishop of Acre carried the True Cross, surrounded by a special guard of knights whose sole duty was to protect it. To lose the True Cross in battle would be a catastrophe beyond measure. At Sephoria, King Guy faced an agonizing decision. His military council was bitterly divided. Raymond III of Tripoli, despite the fact that his own wife was besieged at Tiberias, argued passionately against marching to relieve her. Raymond knew the land, knew Saladin's tactics, and he could see the trap clearly. A Muslim chronicler later recorded that Raymond told the council, "Tiberias is my city, and my wife is in the citadel, and I have more reason than anyone to want to rescue her. But I tell you, if we march into the desert to reach her, we march to our destruction. Saladin wants us to leave our water sources. He wants us exhausted and thirsty when we meet his fresh troops. Let him waste his strength besieging Tiberias. Let him camp in the summer heat while we wait here with water and supplies. He cannot stay forever. Eventually he must withdraw, and then we can strike. But if we march now, on the path he has chosen, at the time he has chosen, we are dead men." Raymond's argument was tactically sound. The position at Sephoria was strong, with ample water from springs and a fortified camp. Saladin could not besiege them there, and if he tried to bypass them to attack other targets, the Crusaders could strike his army from behind. Time was on the Crusaders' side. Saladin's army was large, but that meant it consumed vast quantities of food and water. His forces included many volunteers who would not stay in the field indefinitely. If the Crusaders waited, Saladin's army might simply disintegrate from logistical strain and desertion. But there were powerful voices on the other side. Reynold of Chatillon mocked Raymond's caution, suggesting he was a coward or even a traitor. The Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers argued that to abandon a Christian city without a fight would destroy morale and invite further attacks. Gerard de Riedfort, the Templar Grand Master, was particularly aggressive in pushing for action. He argued that the True Cross itself guaranteed victory and that God would not allow his faithful to be defeated in righteous battle. That evening, after heated debate, King Guy decided to stay at Sephoria and wait. Raymond's counsel had prevailed, or so it seemed. But that night, Gerard de Riedfort went to Guy's tent for a private conversation. No one knows exactly what was said, but the arguments can be reconstructed from later accounts. De Riedfort appealed to Guy's honor, his kingship, his masculinity. He suggested that if Guy did not march, he would be seen as a coward and his authority as king would be fatally undermined. He reminded Guy that during a previous conflict, Guy had been accused of cowardice for not giving battle, and his reputation had never recovered. De Riedfort argued that the entire kingdom was watching, that every noble and soldier wanted to fight, and that only Guy's timidity stood in the way of a glorious victory. He dismissed Raymond's warnings as the words of a man whose loyalties were suspect, who had made truces with Saladin and might even prefer a Muslim victory. Guy of Lusignan was not a strong man, and under this pressure he broke. Early the next morning, July 2nd, 1187, Guy reversed his decision. He ordered the army to prepare to march. When Raymond heard this, he was reported to have said, "Alas, alas, Lord God, the war is over, we have been betrayed unto death." But Raymond was a feudal vassal, and when his king commanded, he had no choice but to obey. The army struck camp and began to march east toward Tiberias. The Crusader army departed Sephoria in the early morning, hoping to cover the 25 kilometers to Tiberias before the day's heat became unbearable. The distance seems modest by modern standards, but for a medieval army weighed down with armor and equipment, in the height of summer, it was a brutal ordeal. The route took them through increasingly dry, rocky terrain with few reliable water sources. The columns stretched for kilometers, with the infantry in front to screen the cavalry from harassment, the knights in the center, and supply wagons bringing up the rear. Saladin had scouts watching every move the Crusaders made. When word reached him that the Christian army had left Sephoria and was marching toward Tiberias, he reportedly smiled and gave thanks to God. The Crusaders had done exactly what he wanted. Saladin immediately lifted the siege of Tiberias and began to maneuver his army to intercept the Christian march. Muslim chroniclers describe Saladin's battle plan with admiration for its cunning. He would not meet the Crusaders in a direct pitched battle where their heavy cavalry could charge in a tight formation. Instead, he would harass them constantly with light cavalry, wear them down, deny them water, and force them to fight when and where he chose. As the Crusader army marched through the hot morning, Saladin's light cavalry began to appear on the flanks and rear. These were primarily Turcoman horse archers, masters of mounted archery, who rode small, tough horses bred for endurance. Each archer carried a composite bow, a technological masterpiece made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, glued together and shaped to store immense energy. These bows could fire arrows accurately at ranges up to 150 meters, and a skilled archer could loose 8 to 12 arrows per minute. The arrows themselves were light, designed not to penetrate the heaviest armor but to wound horses, kill unarmored foot soldiers, and generally cause chaos. A Crusader knight's mail could often stop these arrows, but his horse had less protection, and the infantry were extremely vulnerable. The Muslim cavalry employed classic steppe nomad tactics perfected over centuries. Small groups of 20 to 50 horsemen would ride close to the Crusader column, loose a volley of arrows, and then gallop away before the Crusaders could respond. If the Crusaders tried to charge them, the horse archers simply outran them, then turned and fired arrows at the pursuers. This tactic, known to military historians as the Parthian shot or parting shot, was devastatingly effective against slower, more heavily armored foes. The Crusaders couldn't catch the harassers, couldn't effectively retaliate, and couldn't stop the constant rain of arrows. One Crusader survivor later wrote, "They circled around us like flies, and their arrows fell like rain. When we charged, they fled like ghosts, and when we stopped, they returned to torment us. We could not hurt them, but they hurt us at every moment." The harassment intensified throughout the morning. Horses began to go lame from arrow wounds. Foot soldiers started to fall, struck by arrows that found gaps in their armor or simply from exhaustion. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature soared. Sources from the period suggest temperatures in the Galilee in early July can exceed 40 degrees Celsius, and men carrying 20 kilograms of armor, weapons, and equipment felt every degree. They had expected to reach water by midday, but Saladin's army blocked a direct route. By early afternoon, the Crusader column had only covered about half the distance to Tiberias, and the situation was becoming desperate. The army's water supplies were exhausted. Medieval armies on the march typically relied on water sources along their route, rather than carrying large quantities, which were heavy and quickly depleted. The Crusaders had left Sephoria with some water in skins and barrels, but not nearly enough for an entire army marching through summer heat. As the day wore on, thirst became as dangerous as the enemy arrows. Men began to collapse from heat exhaustion. Discipline started to break down as soldiers left their formations to search desperately for any sign of water. Around mid-afternoon on July 2nd, King Guy was forced to make another critical decision. The army could not reach Tiberias before nightfall, and it was disintegrating from thirst and exhaustion. He called a halt at a place called Mescana, still about 10 kilometers from Tiberias, and critically, still far from any reliable water source. The decision to stop was in some ways inevitable, as the army could not continue, but it also meant spending the night in hostile territory, surrounded by Saladin's army, with no water. Raymond III reportedly argued that they should push on through the night, fighting their way to Tiberias and water regardless of losses. But Guy and the other commanders overruled him. The army made camp, setting up what defensive positions they could on the barren hillside. That night was a torment. The soldiers had no water. The heat of the day gave way to the chill of the desert night, but there was no relief. All around them, the fires of Saladin's army dotted the darkness, and Muslim soldiers could be heard calling out to the Christians, taunting them, promising death in the morning. Saladin's forces also set fire to the dry brush around the Crusader camp. The fires did little actual damage, as there were natural fire breaks, but the smoke blew over the Christian positions, adding to the misery and making breathing difficult. The psychological effect was profound. One chronicler wrote that the Christians spent the night in agony, tormented by thirst, choked by smoke, and filled with dread of the dawn. Saladin, meanwhile, was preparing his final dispositions. His army had spent the day harassing the enemy while staying relatively fresh and well supplied. That night, he arranged his forces in a crescent formation that would envelop the Crusaders the next day. His light cavalry would continue their harassment, but he also brought up his heavier cavalry and infantry for the final assault. He positioned archers on higher ground to rain arrows down on the Christians, and he sent water to his troops from the Sea of Galilee, ensuring they would be fresh for the battle, while the Crusaders suffered from extreme dehydration. The morning of July 3rd, 1187, dawned with the sun already merciless in a cloudless sky. The Crusader army was in desperate condition. Men's tongues were swollen from thirst, their lips cracked and bleeding. Horses were staggering, weakened by lack of water in the previous day's arrow wounds. Morale was shattered, but they had no choice except to try to fight their way to Tiberias and water. At dawn, King Guy ordered the army to resume the march. They had about 10 kilometers to cover, and between them and water stood Saladin's entire army. The army struggled forward, but they barely made any progress before the Muslim attacks intensified. This was no longer harassing fire from distant skirmishers. Saladin's forces now attacked from all sides simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to destroy the Crusader army piece by piece. The vanguard, commanded by Raymond III of Tripoli, tried to push forward and break through to Tiberias, but they ran into a solid wall of Muslim cavalry. The Crusader infantry, already exhausted and demoralized, began to break. Groups of foot soldiers started to veer off from the line of march, heading toward a pair of rocky hills nearby known as the Horns of Hattin. These hills offered some defensive advantage, and critically, the soldiers thought there might be water there. There wasn't. As the infantry fled toward the Horns of Hattin, the entire Crusader formation began to dissolve. King Guy tried to maintain order, to keep the army together and push toward Tiberias, but control was slipping away. The infantry was desperate for water, desperate for protection from the arrows, and when they saw the hills, survival instinct overrode military discipline. Thousands of foot soldiers scrambled up the rocky slopes, seeking whatever shelter the rough terrain could provide. The knights, still relatively intact as a fighting force, found themselves separated from their infantry screen. Saladin's archers now had clear shots at the mounted men, and the arrow fire became devastating. Knights began to fall from their horses, struck in the face or throat where armor was minimal. Horses collapsed, leaving their riders stranded in full armor under the blazing sun. The Crusader cavalry tried several charges to break through the encircling Muslim forces, but each charge ran into prepared positions and was driven back with heavy losses. The True Cross, still with the Bishop of Acre, was somewhere in the chaos, its guard trying desperately to protect it. Raymond III, commanding the vanguard, made a desperate decision. He formed his knights into a tight wedge and charged directly at the Muslim lines facing him, trying to break through to Tiberias. Muslim sources say that Saladin ordered his men to open ranks and let Raymond through, knowing that this would separate him from the main Crusader army. Whether Saladin gave such an order or whether Raymond simply found a weak point and exploited it is unclear, but Raymond and a group of knights did break through and reach Tiberias. However, they found the city already fallen and Saladin's men holding it. Raymond had escaped the trap, but at the cost of abandoning his king and the rest of the army. His reputation would never recover. Some called him a traitor, others said he had no choice, but Raymond III of Tripoli spent the remaining months of his life in disgrace, dying later that year. Back at Hattin, the situation was catastrophic. The bulk of the Crusader army was now divided. The infantry had occupied the Horns of Hattin, but they were surrounded and had no water. The knights, perhaps 800 to 1,000 still mounted, formed a defensive circle around King Guy near the base of the hills. The True Cross was somewhere in this shrinking perimeter. Saladin could see that victory was within his grasp, but he wanted to avoid unnecessary casualties among his own men. He ordered his forces to tighten the noose slowly, to use arrows and fire to break the Christian resistance without risking his troops in close combat with the desperate Crusaders. The heat was now at its peak, perhaps 42 or 43 degrees Celsius. Men in full armor were dying simply from heat exhaustion before they ever faced an enemy blade. The surviving Crusader accounts describe this period as a living hell. One knight wrote years later about the moment he realized they were going to die, saying, "I looked at my brothers around me, men I had known for years, and I saw death in their eyes. Not the clean death of battle, but the slow death of thirst and heat. We prayed for a quick end, for the mercy of a blade rather than this lingering agony." Around midday, the infantry on the Horns of Hattin began to surrender in large numbers. Thirst had broken them completely. They stumbled down from the hills, throwing down their weapons, begging the Muslims for water. Saladin had given orders that prisoners were to be taken if they surrendered, particularly the common soldiers who had fought out of obligation rather than ideology. These men were valuable as slaves or for ransom, and killing them all would be both wasteful and counter to Islamic law, which prohibited unnecessary killing of prisoners. The Muslim soldiers gave water to the surrendering infantry, and the chroniclers note the almost obscene eagerness with which the Christians drank, men fighting each other to reach the water skins. The knights fought on. They made several more charges, trying to break out of the encirclement, but each time they were driven back. The horses were exhausted and dying. Knights who fell from wounded mounts were quickly overwhelmed. The circle around King Guy grew smaller and smaller. The Templars and Hospitallers fought with particular ferocity, knowing that as members of the military orders, they were unlikely to be offered quarter. These warrior monks had taken vows to fight to the death rather than surrender, and they kept those vows. In the early afternoon, disaster struck the Crusaders' morale irreparably. The true cross was captured. The Bishop of Acre had been trying to escape the battlefield, protected by a handful of knights, when Muslim cavalry cut them off. There was a brief, savage fight, and then the true cross fell into Muslim hands. When the knights still fighting saw the true cross captured and the bishop killed, many simply gave up. The belief that God was on their side, that the true cross guaranteed divine protection, was shattered. If God had allowed his own cross to be taken by the infidels, then surely the Crusaders were abandoned, their cause lost. King Guy, Reynaud of Chatillon, Gerard de Ridefort, and the surviving nobles and knights made a final stand around the royal tent. This was no longer a battle but an execution. Saladin's forces surrounded them completely. The Muslim archers fired volley after volley into the tight-packed mass of Christian knights. Horses and men fell in heaps. Those who still could fight swung their swords desperately, but there was nowhere to go, no one to effectively strike. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, the last of the mounted knights were either killed or dismounted, and hand-to-hand fighting broke out around the king's tent. Guy of Lusignan fought with the desperation of a man who knew his kingdom, his crown, and his life were all slipping away, but he was no match for the Muslim warriors surrounding him. He was pulled from his horse and captured. Reynaud of Chatillon was also taken prisoner, as were Gerard de Ridefort and about 200 other knights and nobles. The Battle of Hattin was over. The destruction of the Crusader army was complete. The butcher's bill was staggering. Of the 1,200 knights who had set out from Sephoria, only about 200 survived as prisoners. The rest were dead. Of the 15,000 to 18,000 infantry, most were either dead or captured. Only a few thousand escaped, mainly those with Raymond III or stragglers who fled early in the battle. The true cross was lost. The entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been annihilated in a single day. After the battle, Saladin set up his tent on the battlefield and had the noble prisoners brought before him. King Guy was terrified, certain he would be executed. Muslim custom held that prisoners taken in battle should be treated with respect, but Guy had no way of knowing whether that custom would extend to him. Saladin, however, followed the traditional rules of warfare. He invited Guy to sit and offered him a drink of water cooled with snow from Mount Hermon. A Muslim chronicler who was present recorded the scene with remarkable detail. Guy drank deeply, then passed the cup to Reynaud of Chatillon, who stood beside him. Saladin saw this and became angry. He said, through his interpreter, "Tell the king that it was he who gave Reynaud the water, not I. I do not give drink to that man." In Muslim culture, to offer a captive food or drink created an obligation to spare his life. By noting that he had not given Reynaud water, Saladin was signaling that Reynaud's fate was different. Saladin then personally accused Reynaud of his crimes against Islam, the broken truces, the attacked caravans, the threats against Mecca. Reynaud responded defiantly, saying he had only done what kings and warriors did. Saladin's response was swift. He drew his sword and struck Reynaud, cutting him on the shoulder or neck. The accounts vary on whether this blow killed Reynaud or only wounded him, but in either case Saladin's guards then executed Reynaud completely. Saladin then turned to Guy, who was watching in horror, and said, "A king does not kill a king, but that man overstepped all bounds, and so I treated him accordingly." Saladin's treatment of the prisoners revealed his strategic and political sophistication. King Guy and most of the secular nobles were held for ransom or political purposes. They were valuable bargaining chips and could be used to negotiate surrenders of castles and cities. But the members of the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, received no such mercy. Saladin viewed these warrior monks as the most dangerous and fanatical of his enemies, men who would never make peace and who existed only to fight Muslims. He ordered all captured Templars and Hospitallers to be executed. About 230 knights of the orders were beheaded over the next few days. Saladin offered religious scholars and mystics the honor of performing the executions, and many did so, though the chroniclers note that most of these holy men had no skill with the sword, and the executions were clumsy and brutal affairs. The common soldiers who had been captured faced a different fate. Many were sold into slavery, shipped to markets in Damascus, Alapat, and Cairo, where they were purchased for labor or military service. Islamic law forbade forced conversion, but slaves were given strong incentives to convert to Islam, as Muslim slaves could not legally be kept in permanent bondage and had to be freed or given opportunities to earn their freedom. Many of the captured Crusaders did eventually convert, whether from genuine belief, despair, or pragmatism. The consequences of Hattin were immediate and catastrophic for the Crusader states. With the field army destroyed, the kingdom had no way to defend its cities and castles. Saladin began a systematic campaign of conquest. Acre, the kingdom's greatest port, surrendered on July 10th, just a week after Hattin. Jaffa, another crucial port, fell on July 14th. Sidon surrendered on July 29th. The great fortress of Belvoir held out until January 1189. But most castles and cities surrendered quickly when Saladin appeared at their walls with his army, and a promise of safe conduct for the inhabitants if they yielded without a fight. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin began the siege of Jerusalem itself. The city was crowded with refugees from across the kingdom, perhaps 50,000 people crammed inside walls designed for far fewer. The military commander was Balian of Ibelin, one of the few nobles to have escaped Hattin. He had perhaps a dozen knights and a few thousand militiamen to defend the walls against Saladin's 20,000-man army. The situation was hopeless, but Balian negotiated a surrender that saved lives. On October 2nd, 1187, 88 years after the First Crusade had conquered it, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem's population stands in stark contrast to what the Crusaders had done in 1099. When the First Crusade took Jerusalem, the Crusaders massacred the entire Muslim and Jewish population, perhaps 30,000 people butchered in a 3-day orgy of violence that shocked even medieval chroniclers. Saladin, by contrast, allowed the Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves. Those who could pay 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, and 1 for a child were allowed to leave safely with their possessions. Saladin paid the ransom for many poor people out of his own treasury, and his brother, Al-Adil, bought 1,000 captives and freed them. Even so, thousands who could not pay were enslaved, and there was much suffering, but nothing approaching the wholesale slaughter of 1099. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. When news reached Rome, Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock, though this was probably coincidence. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade. The monarchs of Europe responded. Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all took the cross and set out to reclaim Jerusalem in what became known as the Third Crusade. This crusade would see some of the most famous battles and dramatic moments of the entire Crusader era, but it would not reclaim Jerusalem. Richard and Saladin fought to a stalemate, and when a 3-year truce was signed in 1192, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, though Christian pilgrims were given the right to visit the holy sites. The military aspects of Hattin offer important lessons that military historians still study. Saladin's victory was not the result of any single brilliant tactical innovation, but rather a combination of strategic patience, tactical flexibility, and understanding his enemy's weaknesses. He lured the Crusaders away from their water supplies, harassed them with mobile cavalry they could not effectively counter, and forced them to fight when and where he chose. He understood that he did not need to defeat the Crusader heavy cavalry in direct combat. He only needed to neutralize their greatest strength, their charge, by denying them good terrain exhausting them and their horses, and maintaining the flexibility to retreat when they did charge. The Crusaders, by contrast, made nearly every possible mistake. They abandoned a strong defensive position to march into hostile territory. They allowed themselves to be separated from water. They let their formation disintegrate, and their infantry become separated from their cavalry. And perhaps most critically, they failed to maintain unity of command and purpose, allowing personality conflicts and pride to override sound military judgment. Raymond III's advice was correct from a purely military standpoint, but Guy's political insecurity made him vulnerable to Gerard de Ridefort's pressure to take aggressive action regardless of the risks. When his possessions were inventoried after his death, it was discovered that he had almost no personal wealth. He had given away nearly everything he owned in charity or to reward his followers. There was not enough money in his treasury to pay for his funeral, and his sons had to borrow funds to cover the expenses. This poverty was seen by contemporaries as evidence of his piety and selflessness. He could have been fabulously wealthy, but he chose instead to live modestly and use his resources for the cause he believed in. After Saladin's death, his empire quickly fragmented as his sons and brothers fought over the succession. The unified Muslim front that had been so formidable under Saladin's leadership dissolved into competing dynasties and petty kingdoms, much as it had been before he unified it. This fragmentation allowed the Crusaders to recover somewhat. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was re-established, though much smaller than before, centered on Acre rather than Jerusalem itself. This rump kingdom would survive until 1291, when Acre fell to the Mamluks, finally ending the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The Battle of Hattin occupies a unique place in the history of the Crusades. It was not the largest battle, nor the bloodiest in absolute terms, but it was the most decisive. It destroyed the military power of the Crusader states in a single day and made the recapture of Jerusalem possible. It demonstrated that the Crusaders were not invincible, that their military system had serious vulnerabilities, and that a unified Muslim force under competent leadership could defeat them decisively. It also elevated Saladin to legendary status, making him the model of the Muslim warrior king for centuries to come. For modern students of military history, Hattin offers insights into logistics, tactics, and the importance of matching strategy to circumstances. Saladin won not because he had better weapons or soldiers, but because he had a better understanding of the operational environment and how to exploit his enemy's weaknesses. He recognized that the Crusaders' strength, their heavy cavalry, could be neutralized by the right combination of terrain, weather, and tactics. He understood that an army without water in the desert heat becomes a mob of desperate individuals rather than a coherent fighting force. And he had the patience to wait for the right moment, rather than forcing battle on unfavorable terms. The Crusaders' defeat at Hattin was not inevitable. If King Guy had followed Raymond III's advice and remained at Sephoria, the battle might never have been fought. If the army had carried more water or reached Tiberias before Saladin could intercept them, the outcome might have been different. If the Crusader leadership had been more unified and less prone to personal rivalries, they might have made better decisions. History is full of such contingencies, and Hattin reminds us that even seemingly inevitable outcomes often depend on specific decisions made by specific individuals at critical moments. The cultural and religious dimensions of Hattin also deserve consideration. For Muslims, Hattin and the subsequent recovery of Jerusalem were seen as divine vindication, proof that God favored their cause, and that the Crusader occupation had been an unjust aberration. The victory strengthened Islamic identity and unity, at least temporarily, and reinforced the idea that jihad in defense of Muslim lands was not only justified, but obligatory. For Christians, Hattin was a catastrophe that demanded explanation. Some saw it as punishment for sin, others as a test of faith. The various theological and political interpretations of the defeat shaped Christian responses for generations. influencing everything from crusade preaching to reform movements within the church. In the longer sweep of history, Hattin marked the beginning of the end for the Crusader states, though that end would take another century to complete. It demonstrated that the Crusaders could not hold the Holy Land through military force alone, especially not against a unified Muslim opposition. The Crusader states had survived for 88 years, not primarily because of their military superiority, but because the Muslim world was divided. Once that division was overcome, the territorial losses began and never fully stopped. Later Crusades would achieve tactical successes and recover some territory, but Jerusalem itself remained in Muslim hands, and the trend was irreversibly against the Crusaders. The memory of Hattin has endured in both Western and Islamic traditions, though interpreted very differently. In the West, it became a story of tragedy, of brave knights defeated through no fault of their own, but by overwhelming odds, heat, and thirst. The narrative often emphasizes the martyrdom of the Templars and Hospitallers, the loss of the true cross, and the fall of Jerusalem. Romantic literature, from Walter Scott's novels to modern films, has perpetuated an image of Hattin as a noble defeat, with Saladin portrayed as a worthy and chivalrous opponent. In Islamic tradition, Hattin is remembered as one of the greatest victories in Muslim history, the moment when Saladin broke the Crusaders' power and reclaimed Jerusalem. It is celebrated in poetry, histories, and popular culture as an example of what can be achieved through faith, unity, and capable leadership. In our own time, Hattin continues to resonate. It is sometimes invoked in political rhetoric in the Middle East as a symbol of resistance against foreign occupation. Saladin himself has been claimed as a hero by various modern movements and regimes, from Arab nationalists to Islamists, each interpreting his legacy to suit their purposes. This appropriation of medieval history for modern politics is not unique to Hattin or Saladin, but it demonstrates how powerful these historical memories remain and how they continue to shape contemporary identities and conflicts. What lessons can we draw from Hattin that transcend its specific historical context? Perhaps the most important is the danger of overconfidence and the importance of understanding your enemy. The Crusaders went into battle believing their cause was just and that God would grant them victory. They underestimated Saladin's capabilities, overestimated their own invulnerability, and made decisions based on pride and political considerations rather than sound military judgment. Saladin, by contrast, studied his enemy carefully, understood their strengths and weaknesses, and planned his campaign to exploit those weaknesses systematically. He combined strategic vision with tactical flexibility, knowing when to wait and when to strike, when to show mercy and when to be ruthless. Another lesson is the critical importance of logistics in military operations. Hattin was won and lost not primarily through skill at arms, but through control of water supplies. The side that ensured its soldiers had water, food, and rest prevailed over the side that did not, regardless of the quality of individual warriors. This principle, that armies march on their stomachs and fight with full water skins, has been proven again and again throughout military history. Modern military doctrine emphasizes logistics for precisely this reason, and the disaster at Hattin is often cited in military academies as a case study in what happens when logistics are neglected. Finally, Hattin reminds us of the human cost of war and the suffering of ordinary people caught up in conflicts driven by the ambitions and beliefs of rulers and religious leaders. The thousands of common soldiers who died of thirst and exhaustion on the march to Hattin, the civilians of Jerusalem who were enslaved when they could not pay ransom, the families torn apart by war, these are the people who paid the price for the grand strategies and religious passions of their leaders. Medieval chroniclers often overlooked these ordinary people, focusing on kings and nobles, but their suffering was real and immense. A complete understanding of Hattin must include not just the tactical brilliance of Saladin and the errors of King Guy, but also the agony of a foot soldier collapsing from dehydration, the despair of a family sold into slavery, the grief of a widow whose husband died in a battle he never wanted to fight. The Battle of Hattin stands as one of the pivotal moments in medieval history. A single day, July 1187, when the fate of kingdoms was decided, when thousands of lives were lost, and when the balance of power in the Middle East shifted dramatically. It was a battle won through careful planning, tactical sophistication, and understanding of how environmental factors could be weaponized against an enemy. It was lost through overconfidence, poor decision-making, and failure to adapt tactics to circumstances. And it changed the world, setting in motion events that would shape Christian-Muslim relations for centuries to come. As we look back across more than 800 years to that burning hillside at Hattin, we can see both the specifics of medieval warfare and the timeless principles of strategy, leadership, and human nature. We can appreciate Saladin's genius without overlooking his ruthlessness. We can understand the Crusaders' errors without dismissing their courage. And we can recognize that history is made not by abstract forces, but by the decisions of individuals, the clash of armies, and the suffering and triumph of human beings caught up in events larger than themselves. Hattin was one day, one battle, but its echoes have sounded through the centuries and continue to resonate today. A reminder of how a single moment can change everything, and how the choices we make in crisis can determine not just our own fate, but the fate of nations.